Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing this morning? You know what I'm asking. Everybody doing all right? Everybody hanging in there? That's good. That's good. That was our team took the road less traveled by last night. So see how I want to tie that in. I honestly had a talk last night with my 13-year-old son, who's he played football this year. So now, when you play it, you really understand it better, and he's really invested in it. And we had a serious talk last night about how do you get past that kind of loss. And I just told him the gospel truth. I said, you don't. I said, all we have left, son, is petty revenge. To root for the Chiefs to hand it to the Titans next week. That's all that we're left. See, I'm bringing gospel to my family. But yeah, it was tough. And I even woke up this morning and said, Lord, help lift all of our spirits to those of us who are fans. I am jealous of those of you that don't care, right? Like I'm looking at my buddy, Mr. Fonte there. You don't give a rip, do you? You woke up this morning, I can't say the sun was shining, but life was going on, right? That's how I want to be next year. If I can somehow get that where the effect of whatever happens to my beloved team is the equivalent of reading something about the Russian ballet didn't win some kind of championship. I'm not going to lose any sleep over that. But it is good to be together, honestly, particularly in this kind of hard, wintry, mid-Atlantic gray season, because we can look at some things together that hopefully will lead us to some better places, and that's what we want to do today. I was supposed to say something about this. This is a football injury. It really is. I was down in M&T last night warming up Lamar, and that might explain everything. And no, I was out here actually on the church parking lot with my son Isaac, and he just threw a laser to me. And even though I have nothing but athletic dexterity, I jammed and probably broke my finger. So thank you, Wendy Macy, for giving me a splint this morning. It is not comfortable, so that's what that's about, nothing else. I'd rather tell you something before we dive in. We're going to do this for the next few Sundays. Just want to highlight some partners in the gospel. This book that we're in, the book of Philippians, this series, The Road Less Traveled, Counterintuitive Truth, is going to give us a chance to see how in the first century, the movement, the Jesus movement, was built on people who partnered together. It was not a one-man show, one-woman show. Wasn't a group of just a team of highly influential, charismatic leaders that had, great gravitas or something like that. It was just everyday folks going shoulder to shoulder, partnering together. So I want to bring up a picture of a lovely lady in our church. This is Catherine Graber and her beautiful family. It's her husband, Anthony, and her kids, Aiden, Annie, and Eleanor. If you've come into the church, sometimes you've probably been greeted by Catherine. Lovely smile, just has a warm, affectionate presence about her. And I had the privilege of talking to her yesterday and talked to her about her experience at CFC. She came here in May of 2018, so she's been here for just coming up on 2 years this spring, and just asked her what it's been like to be on the Serve team. And she said it's been wonderful. They're from New England. Now, I vetted her. She's not a football fan because we only allow one to show that we care about God's grace, but not too much to let in a bunch of Patriots fans. But she doesn't care about football. Right now, that beautiful family is about to expand by one. She's due literally any moment. And just last week, she had a bad illness that kind of landed her in the hospital while she's 9 months pregnant, and is all better now, is all at home. But I just wanted to highlight that Catherine is somebody that I think Paul, who wrote this letter that we're in this winter, would have said, that's one of my partners. She understands that greeting somebody coming into the church has tremendous value. Not only has it brought personal benefit to her to meet some people and to partner with people in a church that she wouldn't otherwise know anybody in, it's given her a chance to meet new people. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever been invited to a party where you don't know anybody, or there's a business or educational orientation where you don't know anybody, that's an apprehensive feeling, isn't it? See, if you've been in the church for any length of time, you're kind of comfortable and used to it, but remember that feeling when you're nervous, you don't know what to expect, and sometimes a person like Catherine that greets you when you come in can really make all the difference. So if you see her around, you might not see her for a few weeks when the baby comes along. But just thank her if you would. And we're thankful for everybody serving on our teams. Now let's get back into this wonderful, exciting, truth-packed book of Philippians as we consider what are some of these counterintuitive truths that we would never get to naturally. We're never going to drift towards naturally, but maybe with a little time, a little help, we can learn to master some of these. And here's one that I know you cannot do without some help. I certainly can't. Let me ask you this question. Can you imagine life without yourself at the center? Nobody wants to admit that, right? Because did the guy up there just say I'm self-centered? Let me take away. I don't want to offend anybody. Yes, you are. And I know you are. And I know that, well, I know that I am from personal experience, and I've been married for 25 years. So I know full well how things revolve in my mind around the great unholy trinity of me, myself, and I. But I know it because Jesus actually never, ever, did you ever notice this? If you read the Bible, even for 5 minutes, Jesus never commands us to love ourselves. Jesus assumes that we love ourselves. Why? Because he says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. I might need to love myself hard. No, he already knows that when you wake up in the morning, you're thinking about you. He already knows when you go to bed at night, your grand occupation is you. I have sat in a room with people, you ever done this, that get their personality test results back? And some of the kindest, most other-centered people I've ever met, but if you give them a personality test results, we all become PhD interested experts in ourselves, don't we? I remember one time it was handed out, somebody said, hey, look, hold on, because they want to read about themselves, right? And that's all of us. That is the human condition, and the message today isn't about that per se, but it's our starting point. Can you imagine what life would look like if you were not the center? I don't know about you. That's very hard. Now, part of it is it's impossible, right? Because we have to, by definition, see through the filter of our own perspective, right? I don't know what life was like before September of 1970 because I wasn't there. I can read about it in books, I can see it in films, but I don't really know. But I think this passage today invites us to consider something that we would never drift into. We would never by happenstance just become less and less about ourselves. So let's take a look at one man's experience. It's this leader in the early church known as the Apostle Paul. Let's notice how he continues as he writes this letter. We'll start at chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, and again, he's writing to this group of very young first century Jesus followers in the city of Philippi. He says, I want you guys to know that what's happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. Now, what's happened to me? What is that? What has happened to Paul? Because I might use that today to say, oh man, I had the most difficult weekend of anybody in the universe because I jammed my finger and my football team lost. Nobody's got it tougher than me right now, right? Although 11 o'clock last night, I was feeling that way. What happened to Paul, you can't even hold a candle to, because this seems to be a regular experience for him. What has happened to me? And let's just continue on here. What has happened to him has served to advance the gospel. So there's something that has happened to him that has advanced the gospel. Now, I'm just going to take away all the suspense. What's happened to him at this point is he's writing in prison. Now, we don't know conclusively what prison context he's referencing. The scholars and the commentators, they often will propose three, Ephesus, Caesarea, or Rome. I tend to lean towards Rome. Really doesn't change anything. Paul is writing with his freedom taken away. Whether he's on a version of house arrest, which today would be the ankle bracelet sort of way of living, or whether he's actually in a detention center, I don't think any of us would trade his experience for our experience. Paul says, but what's happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Now that's strange, because if something happens to me, it's all about me. and I'm going to tell you everything. I learned early on in marriage, Lisa, who has always had to teach me these things, says, Greg, when we got in the car, after a woman shared her horrible pregnancy story, and C-section story, and pain, and being in the hospital for all this time, she goes, why did you feel a need to talk about your wisdom tooth extraction? Like, just give me the connection from point A to point. Well, she was just talking about how she was in pain, and I know exactly what she went through because I had my wisdom teeth out. And, she made that very clear that was never going to happen again. And it hasn't. So whenever I hear a woman talk about anything I just zip my lips, listen, and understand there's something here to be absorbed, and I have nothing to compare it to. This is the way we tend to think of ourselves. How did it affect me? How did this trial affect me? And Paul, you already notice a counterintuitive truth. What's happened to me in prison has served to actually advance the gospel. Now, as we saw last week, the gospel is just Christian shorthand for the good news. It's a proclamation of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. What's happened to me, even me right now, loss of my personal freedom and independence, has actually been good for the gospel. Here's a question I just want to plant in your mind right now and have you consider. How special, then, must the gospel be if it is the ultimate measurement of what is good and what is bad? How special must it be? Because if it is the ultimate measurement of what's good or what's not good, it's got to be the greatest thing. This is what Paul is telling us. I mean, because in a sense, why is this guy talking about this religious thing? Why is he talking about this preaching thing? I mean, he's in prison. I mean, shouldn't we be rallying around this guy, put a GoFundMe page up for his family? I mean, why is he not just in ultimate misery? Because he understands that the advancement of this message is actually more significant than his personal circumstances. Now, the first thing that Paul sees that I would never see unless somebody helped me is, look what's happened as a result of him being in prison. So it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. Now, imagine Paul sitting down with a group of fellow Christians and say, guys, tell me how Jesus has changed your life. And people say, oh, he's done this. He's forgiven my sins. He's given me a new identity. And Paul says, man, same thing. Let's come up with some people that don't know this message. Eventually, they might get, hey, what about those guys that are employed for Rome? They probably never hear about Jesus, right? I mean, these guys got to do Caesar's bidding. They're not here in our church meetings. They're not here in our Sunday morning gathering. They're not looking at our PowerPoint. They're out doing this work. How can we get the gospel to them? And maybe somebody says, hey, I got it, a direct mail campaign. Hey, I got it. Why don't I start a little coffee house kind of Bible study at Starbucks for the prison guards here at the detention center? Right? Good ideas. Everybody's saying it, and everybody votes on their idea, and then God shows up and says, oh, I'd like to cast my vote. Paul, I'm going to make sure that you end up in prison, and then you'll reach those people. Like, whoa, time out, Lord, time out. How about there's another way? Lord, did you hear us talk about the direct mail campaign? I mean, I think that's more effective, and God has a way of reminding us, even in the most difficult of circumstances, oh, I have a plan to reach people that don't know about me, and it will often be actualized through, this is hard to even say, our personal trials and inconveniences. Paul says, this is actually, I know you think it's terrible, hold off on the GoFundMe page right now. Because I have an audience that I would never have. These guards that are here, and you read about this, interestingly enough, I'll just mark it for you, I don't have it up, but Acts chapter 16 tells us when Paul was in Philippi, he was actually in prison, and he is singing hymns. Did y'all like when we sang it as well with my soul today? I mean, that hymn will speak peace to me until the day I cross over. Paul is singing a hymn. He's in prison. And God sends an earthquake that would have allowed Paul to escape the prison cell, and other prisoners are starting to run, and a jailer there, we don't know his name, a guard, one of these imperial guards, is about to take his life because he knows the cost of letting prisoners go. And Paul stops and says, stop, what are you doing? And the jailer says, what must I do to be saved? Why is he asking Paul that? Because he's heard him singing all night. Who sings to this Jesus in this miserable situation? It's completely counterintuitive. And Paul says, this has turned out good for me. Now, we have to be very careful here, because we want to be known for our identification with Jesus. We don't want to be known because we are obnoxious and also happen to be Christians. Like, I got to be very careful here. I had a gentleman tell me this 2 or 3 years ago, how he was at a meeting, and he goes, oh, Greg, you wouldn't believe what these people, they were calling me a jerk, they were calling me this, they were calling me that. And I realized he was kind of beaming with pride because he thought he was being persecuted for being a Christian. And I drew him out a little bit. Tell me, what did you say then? Well, this one lady, and I interrupted. I didn't let her finish that thought. Okay, and stuff. And then this other guy tried to, and I shouted him down. I said, okay. And I remember thinking, I think they didn't like you because you're unlikable. I think they didn't like you because you're a jerk. And it may have been better if you had maybe not also told them that you're a Christian. You know what I mean? I mean, we got to get real about this stuff here. Our being known in adverse circumstances should be known, or we should be known for our identification with Jesus, the degree to which we reflect Jesus, not just some self-deputized license to behave however we want and say, well, they don't like me, it's because I'm a Christian. Not necessarily so. Do you realize Peter, the Apostle Peter, understood this was a potential problem in the first century? I think a lot of people say, hey, here's my moment of limelight. They won't like me. And notice what Peter says. It's very interesting. He says, if you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. We might say a busybody, somebody that puts his nose in business he has no business getting involved in. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God. Notice that you bear that name, Christian, or to be literalistic about it, little Christ. That's how Christians were understood, first named that way in the city of Antioch. Jesus followers. There's big Rabbi Jesus walking down the road, and there's his entourage walking behind him, wanting to be like him. Make sure that your identification, he says, is connected there. Now let's continue to see what Paul says about his own imprisonment. He says, and most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. This is fascinating to me. Why is Paul happy again? Because, hey, I heard any day, this is Morgan Freeman, right, in the Shawshank Redemption. Any day my parole hearing is coming up. Oh, yes, sir, I'm a changed man. Oh, absolutely. I'm totally reformed, and he's waiting for his moment. Paul is not saying he's excited because he senses that his parole is coming. He says, do you realize, because people have heard about me, that this has actually lit a fire in what's happening? More people are sharing Jesus to more people. They're bold. They're proclaiming it. Well, that's good, but the Bible doesn't give us any kind of Hollywood slickness here. It gives us earthy realism. Not all those people that are proclaiming have the best motives. Notice what he says. Some of these people that are preaching, they preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. Now, this can't be, right? I mean, it can't happen in the church that people do things for God with bad motives, can it? That doesn't happen, right? I mean, no preacher has ever preached a sermon and hoped that people would tell them, man, you hit it out of the park. That's never happened, right? Nobody's ever visited somebody in the hospital hoping that somebody might post a picture of that person on their social media feed. That doesn't happen, right? I mean, we all have pure as the driven snow motives, tongue firmly implanted in my cheek this morning. This is one of the realities of life. Yes, in the hospital for sinners that is the church, we're still a mess. We're still a mess. We're striving. We're striving. But sometimes people say, I can't believe he acted that way. He's a Christian. Why? What is a Christian? It's a sinner who's been forgiven of his or her sins. Now, yes, there's a standard, there's a call, there's something to which we aspire to be less and less like ourselves and more like Jesus. But I'm not so sure why this would be so shocking. We know this has to be true because if you've ever been to a wedding, you've heard this passage. I'm talking about 1 Corinthians 13. And in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul also wrote this: if I give away all I have and deliver up my body to be burned. Now, I would say that's pretty gutsy Christian obedience, would you not? I'm going to give away all my possessions and offer myself up to be martyred, but have not love, I gain nothing. In other words, there is a kind of altruistic-looking conformity. There is a kind of do-goodism that would get everybody in every church posting stories about this example. And Paul knows, but in the deep recesses of the hearts, there's not love. That's a shocking verse to me. We can commit ourselves to great acts, but our motives be thoroughly compromised. Now, notice how this informs Paul's perspective, even as he's writing in his imprisonment. The latter do so out of love. So there's a group of young preachers out there. That's what Paul seems to be saying, that are preaching out of love, which is shorthand for kind of pure obedience, whatever you want to put in it, for God's glory, for the sake of lost people that don't yet know Jesus, for the good of the church. They're just motivated by good things, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. In other words, they say, Paul, he's there because he's been faithful to the gospel. But the former group, they preach Christ out of what? Selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. Now, what appears to be happening here is there's a group of young kind of hotshots that are out there and they're preaching and they're going to places and cities and they're sharing the message of Jesus with other people, and people are responding positively, right? Crowds are gathering, churches are being planted, people are growing in their faith as a result of these guys out there. But what seems to be the implicit message about Paul? It probably goes something like this: hey guys, like Paul, he's kind of old school. You know, he's yesterday's news. Right? You know, this guy thinks Sandy Patty is a current Christian artist. You know, whatever we would say. This guy is out of touch. He's out of sync. And you know he is, because he's in prison. Right? I mean, how much could God be blessing him if he's in prison? But I'm out here free as a bird. See how that kind of works? Now, this is a dangerous illustration. I made the mistake last night of watching some of the post-game presser of the Titans. That's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to appeal to the dark places that I was appealed to last night, where they're mocking, Big Truss, and they're mocking, Lamar, and they're mocking Ingram and these guys. And I'm watching this, and I'd like to tell you that I had nothing but love for those gentlemen. I'd like to tell you that, but I'm going to stop right there. Now, that's nothing. That's me after a game. I'm sitting in prison because I've been faithful to preach what God's called me to preach, and there's some young hotshot kids out there that are dissing me. I am livid. How dare they? Where's their sense of appreciation? Where's their sense of gratitude? Notice what Paul says. What does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And in this I rejoice. What does it matter? See, what we learn here is, by implication, these young guys aren't false teachers. They're not heretics. He deals with those in other letters, like in Galatians, where he would say, they might have the purest motives, but what they're saying is harmful to people's eternal destinies. And Paul throws down a gauntlet and says, how dare they do that? He calls them out. And he does it in other places by name. These guys, he just knows that they're getting a kick out of old Paul in prison. But he says, you know what? I think that Jesus they're preaching is true. I think the message they're preaching is right, because men or women with impure motives in God's amazing grace can still be used by God to preach his truth. I rarely talk about this, but the pastor who baptized me when I was 16, when I was 18, I learned that he had been arrested for some very serious crimes regarding minors. And I remember going through it was my first kind of moment, like, whoa, was this this man baptized me. And then I realized my baptism was legitimate, because it's always a sinner that dunks another sinner. And it's always Jesus and his grace that covers everything. And Paul's in prison and goes, God will sort out all their motives. God will sort out all their petty ambitions and selfish ambitions. But you know what? Jesus is being preached, and his heart is rejoicing. I don't know how we'll ever get there intuitively. I do know this. God has a way of reminding us of these things. I think I've told this before, but it's been some time. My first church down in Catonsville, Maryland, my then mentor, Dave Shive, has been here before. You've been here for any length of time to preach and teach. Dave was the senior pastor. I was an associate pastor. And this is 97, 98. I missed that time because we didn't have kids yet. And that's one of the last times I remember Lisa and I kind of being allies. Like we kind of ministered together. And there was a woman who I'm going to call Sarah, and I pray that I don't slip, and I don't think she's ever been here. Anybody would know. Very sweet lady who had a very difficult past. And she came to church one time, talked to my wife Lisa in the back, and Lisa said, Greg, we've got to talk to Sarah. She's really hurting. And so we spent weeks with Sarah. She called us one night. It was midnight. We were in bed. We'd been asleep for an hour at this point, and she was distraught. She was upset, and she called and said, Pastor Greg, I'm just really confused right now and hurting. And Lisa, we didn't have kids, so we got out of bed, and we went over to her place, and we stayed up with her till 5 o'clock in the morning, and we were praying, and we were talking, and by the end we were laughing, and it was a special moment, and Sarah got increasingly connected to the church. About a year later, I had a month where I was just beginning to feel some flatness, just kind of already the grind of the day-to-day, not much exciting stuff happening. And we had a little gathering here of people. Oh, there's an important detail I should share. A couple weeks earlier, Dave Shive, who had never really talked with this woman, grabbed me after church and said, hey, that woman Sarah that you and Lisa have connected to, can you get me an address for her? I said, oh, absolutely, yeah. So I gave Dave her address, and I think he wrote her a little note of encouragement. Now, a couple weeks later, we're all gathered, and with a bunch of the leaders in the church and some people that have been there in the church for about 2 years. It's kind of an orientation. It was nice, about 30 people there. And then Dave leads the meeting and has the new people start going around the room. Now, I know how to put on humble, holy face, so listening, this is good, this is good. And then I see that they're coming to Sarah. And I thought, the question is, what brought you to this church? And in my mind, I'm sitting there thinking, I am going to get so many strokes. And maybe Lisa too. But I am going to get my moment in the sun. Now, I'd love to tell you I didn't feel that way, but that's exactly what I was feeling. I was craving it. I was wanting it. And then it's Sarah's turn, and I lean in just, what's Sarah going to say? And she goes, I'm here in this church for one reason. Dave Shive. I remember. Praise the Lord. And she proceeds for 10 minutes to talk about this note of encouragement that Dave wrote her. Right? One note. One note. By the way, I'm not making this up. After the meeting, Dave says, oh, is that the woman I wrote the note to? proceeds to tell everybody how she's here because of Dave Chappelle. Well, I'm going to get a mention. You know, I'll get a supporting actor. Man. Nothing for 10 minutes. Now, I know how to fake it. God is good. And I got in my car seething. Because where is the praise coming? Where's the accolade? Where's the attaboy? Where's the pat on the back? Missing the entire time. That this woman was now more increasingly connected to the church, was partnering with people, was freer to share her faith in Jesus to people. I didn't care about any of that. I cared about getting my stroke. And this is a post-seminary ordained version of me. That's who I am. Paul said we don't preach ourselves, right? But we preach Jesus Christ is crucified. I got nothing to preach about myself. I'm a train wreck just like you are. I want the same petty affirmation that you want. Some of us learn how to fake it better. There's very few of us that make that step. And here the whole while, what's happening? Christ is being preached. Woman's being encouraged, edified. She's affecting more people. And I'm just so worried about myself. So may I invite you to consider this example that we have taken in today. If I were to summarize it in a takeaway thought, I would just put it like this. True joy is not about self-advancement, but gospel advancement. What was happening last month in Thailand, those of you that generously gave, was far more significant than what was happening in our living rooms, or our Ravens parties last night. What's happening when people become more exposed to Jesus Christ is far more important. And may our joy be tied to that. May our personal failures melt away. May our personal ambitions melt away. Now, I'm not going to give you like 2 steps to make this happen. Maybe the step for you and the step for me is just this. Lord, continue to remind me through passages like this, through friends like this, through examples like this, that nothing is more important than your gospel advancing in the world. And may our joy be increasingly tied to that. It's not going to happen overnight, but maybe a year from now, 10 years from now, we can look back and say, I find that I'm caring a little bit more about the gospel being advanced and a little bit less about my personal circumstances. Would you make that a prayer? And let me pray for us. Lord, thank you that Christ is preached here in Forest Hill, Bel Air, and Harford County, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in China, in Brazil. Would your gospel radiate, permeate? May it continue to advance, that more and more people would know how awesome Jesus is. And may we begin, just step by step, letting our lives be informed by that and measuring success or failure by that. Lord, we'll never get there. We can't do it. We're sinners. But by your grace and Spirit, through the help of the church and each other, we can take step after step. Would you make us those people so that others might see how awesome, not we are, but Jesus is. In his name we pray. Amen.